I'm pleased to introduce to you our executive speaker, Mr. Jere Thompson, Jr. Mr. Thompson made his first communion in the St. Rita Chapel when it stood by itself just west of the railroad track, which is today the Dallas North Toll Road. He attended Christ the King School before entering Cistercian in 1965. Cistercian opened its new building that year near the Trinity River, long before Las Colinas, DFW, Texas Stadium, Highway 114 existed. While students in Dallas schools had snow days back then, Cistercian offered flood days because every time the Trinity flooded, access to the school was blocked by high water. His graduating class of 21 was the largest in Cistercian history. Mr. Thompson received an economics degree from Stanford University and an MBA from the University of Texas at Austin. He's been an entrepreneur for the past 20 years, founding Caprock Fiber Network to build fiber and broadband data networks throughout Texas and neighboring states, and most recently, Ambit Energy to provide electricity and natural gas services. In 2010, Ambit was named by Inc. magazine as America's #1 fastest growing private company. Mr. Thompson sits on the board on numerous civic boards, including Cistercians. He and his wife, Carolyn, have been married for 26 years and have 5 children. They attend Mass at Perkins Chapel on SMU campus and Christ the King. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for the invitation to come to speak to everybody. I'm really honored. I'm excited to see what you're doing here and how you all come together to meet as an organization. I think it's just fantastic, and I'm excited to see what you all are doing with each other and the way you pull together a new organization. I like entrepreneurs, and you've kind of done that. Before I start, I'd like to ask my wife, Carolyn, to say that. We've been married for 26 years. Person in my faith journey, but I'm not going to talk about it tonight. I'm going to talk about business instead. But anyway, just to let you know, this is my better half. What I thought I'd do tonight is to break my talk into 3 pieces. The first is to talk about Ambit for a little bit, and then talk about Cistercian, because that's been such an important part of my life. And third, to talk about balance, which I think is a struggle everybody has in their own life. So let me start with Ambit. In the summer of 2005, I submitted an application to Austin to become a retail electricity provider. This is after they deregulated the electricity markets here in Texas. By the end of the year, I'd gotten all the green lights and all the approvals in place to get started with this electricity company. And we had our first systems ready in early 2006. And once those systems were ready to be the back office for this new company, we had to go out and get customers. Well, getting a customer is kind of a challenge when you go to folks and say, hey, I've started this new electricity company. I've never done it before, but trust us. The lights are going to stay on. A lot of people push back, but fortunately, my parents and Carolyn both agreed to become our first customers. They just said, please keep the lights on. I said, no problem. So we converted them over in March of 2006, and everything worked great for about 1 month. And then one afternoon, Carolyn called me in April and said, hey, Jerry, is there any reason why the lights are on? And I said, are you sure? She said, yeah, very definitely, all the lights are off. We have no power. And I said, well, let me call you back, and hung up. And I stood up, and as I stood up, I looked around at the people around. There were only 3 or 4 of us in the company at that time, and I said, does anybody know why our power is on? And they just looked at me. I said, somebody accidentally sent a disconnect notice to Encore. And everybody just had this blank stare. And I began to get a sinking feeling. Because when you start a company, you know what you know, and you know what you don't know, but you don't know what you don't know. And my fear was this was landing in that bucket. The phone rings again. It's one of our guys driving back to the office. And he said, hey, Jere, I just turned on the radio, but because of this early heat wave, there's not enough power on the grid. So TXU is having rolling brownouts all over town. I went, oh, that's great news. He didn't understand how the phone rings again. Carolyn, she said, oh, the lights just came back on, thank you very much. And I said, no problem. We nailed it. It was our very first customer service call. And we also realized at that moment in time that we were ready to get started. We had the systems we would need to be be able to convert customers over, to bill them, to collect from them, and to provide customer care. But we didn't know how we were going to go out and gather customers. And what I was looking for was the opportunity to find customers at a low acquisition cost that would pay their bill and stay loyal. It was the trifecta. And one of the guys in the room said, well, you really ought to consider direct sales. I was at Excel Communications, and when they went public, they had the lowest cost of customer acquisition, the lowest bad debt rate, and the lowest attrition rate in the entire long-distance industry. And they said, if you want to go down this path, you need to meet this guy named Chris Chambliss. Chris was the 52nd employee at Excel, and he was there when they were growing rapidly. At the same time, he saw what worked and what didn't work. So he and I met the next day at a pot bellies on Beltline Road up in Addison. And we started talking about the prospects of electricity and where the future might be for it. And he got really excited. And he said, if you want to do this, think about it over the weekend and call me. And I thought about it over the weekend, called him on Monday and said, Chris, let's start. So Chris came into the office the next day. And we looked at this, and the first thing we did was sit down and begin to map out what kind of company we wanted to build. And we talked about our goals, and we talked about our reputations, and we talked about the reputations of people who might come in and join our company. And we knew that whenever anybody might become an Ambit customer or consultant, or approach somebody to become an Ambit customer or consultant, they would be trusting that Ambit would get it right, that we would deliver as promised, not some of the time, but all the time. And we really wanted to be worthy of their trust. We wanted them to be proud of their association with Ambit. And so our very first decision was to be the finest and most respected retail electricity provider in America. Now, those are pretty big words for a tiny startup that only had a couple of customers. But we saw a great promising future out there, in the horizon. But I still had some doubts about direct sales. There's a lot of great direct sales companies. Mary Kay is one, Home Interior is one, Avon, and there are a lot of really good ones out there, but there's also some rogues out there that tarnish the name of all the good ones. And so I called a guy over at Mary Kay, a guy named Michael Lunsford. And I said, Michael, how has Mary Kay been able to build and keep such a great reputation over the past few decades? And he said very simply, never sacrifice integrity for growth. And I said, can I quote you on that? He said, absolutely. So we took that. And we moved down into a warehouse building here in downtown Dallas in the West End. And we ripped out all of the walls. We wanted a wide open space. We wanted light streaming through the many windows. We polished those hardwood floors, which were almost 100 years old. And we lit the red bricks. And what we were trying to do is create an open office environment. To me, it's the best way to build an atmosphere for building a company, because the communications is rapid and you're able to talk to people without ever getting onto your desk. And so we opened it up, and then we did something that was somewhat unique. Instead of having in the offices everybody sitting out in the open, but we also pulled out these $19 fold-up tables, and we set them all up. And people looked at me like, you're crazy. These tables, everybody's going to think we have no money. And I said, well, we're going to put all of our money into outstanding systems and great people, not fancy offices or elegant furniture. And the smart people will understand it. Don't worry about anybody else. Well, the moment I laid that challenge out there, everybody wanted to be smart, so they said, oh yeah, I agree with you, that's right. So we put all these fold-up tables throughout the executive area, and at that time, throughout the entire company. And we got started. Now, when we started the company, we knew from our telecom experiences that operationally we would be a data processing company. Everything that we did would involve data. It would be sending, receiving, processing, storing, sharing, presenting data. So operationally, we would be a data processing company. And we saw in our telecom days that those companies who had great back offices and systems really thrived and prospered, while all those other companies who didn't disappeared. When the data volume hit them, it was like a tidal wave, capsized them, and they disappeared. So we got started. We finally realized that there were no systems we could buy off the shelf. We decided to build our own. And the moment we decided to build our own, it was an unconventional idea. Nobody did that. And so our CIO came in, and we just said, let's get started. He rolled up his sleeves, and we started hearing all the snickering in the industry, and we just ignored it. What we knew is that we didn't want to be like everybody else and have the same returns as everybody else. We didn't even want to think like everybody else. We didn't hire one person from the electricity industry for the first 4 years. Anytime we needed to find information about the industry or something to do, we Googled it. which is unheard of when it's the new technology that's out there. And that was helping us to get started to build these systems and put ourselves in place. By the end of the summer of 2006, those first systems were ready to get started. We were able to get out into the marketplace, and everything worked. By 2007, we expanded up into New York, and everything worked there too. We were on a roll and growing very, very fast. 2008 came around, and we thought the world was at our doorstep. Things were going great. And then all of a sudden, overnight, we entered our darkest hour, which also became our defining moment. We started to receive a trickle of complaints from customers up in New York City. And they said they'd never heard of Ambit Energy. They'd never asked for us to be their electricity provider. And the trickle turned into a stream, and the stream turned into a flood. And that's when we knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a problem. Something was going wrong out there. So we gathered the data on all the customers who had complained and laid it side by side. And electronically began our investigation to find what the common denominator was. And what we were looking for was who was making money by these customers being with Ambit. And within about 2 hours, we realized that all of these complaints were traced back to 4 different consultants, 4 people. So we called these consultants up, we did a quick investigation, and we immediately terminated them. We kicked them out of the business. That was the easy part. Now came the hard part, the part that we were terrified about. That was how much and how should we communicate what had happened. We could have disclosed everything. We could have gone out into the marketplace and said, this is what happened. But this was a brand new state. We might have gotten kicked out of our second state. It could have jeopardized our standing in Texas. It might block our entry into future states as we want to expand. Or, worst of all, it could have caused our consultants to flee. So it was a gut-wrenching decision on what was the right thing to do. And it was one of those things we prayed about. Well, we ultimately decided to risk everything. We had to get it out there. We decided that what was happening, that misbehavior, was a cancer that would quickly spread in our business. And we had to cut it out right away. So what we did is we sent a letter to every consultant we had all across the country. Those that were not even associated, most everybody didn't even know it had happened. And we explained in detail that this is what went on. And we're not trying to sweep this thing under the rug and hide it. We want everybody to be aware of our values. And we told them that we meant what we said about never sacrificing integrity for growth. And that we want them to please each other and to please themselves and do the right thing. And if you ever have any questions, get back in touch with us and let us know. And we told them they need to protect their reputations, our reputations, as well as all of our future opportunities. And then came the hard part. With our hearts pounding, we decided to call it the New York PSC, Public Utilities Commission, same thing that we have down here in Texas. And we told them the exact same thing. And we knew that the New York PSC were the folks that could revoke our license to operate up in our second state. Our whole future was hanging by a thread as we had this conversation with them. And we explained what had happened, how we had found these consultants. We terminated them. We read to them the letter that we had sent to all the other consultants. We said, you don't know who we are, but we want to let you know that we're going to do the right thing. If ever we find this misbehavior again, we're going to kick it out of the business. And then we went off to Con Edison, the utility company, and we gave them the exact same explanation. And then we waited for the fallout. Well, it didn't take but a couple of days. The phones rang. New York PSC and Con Edison came back to us, and they said, you are the very first company to ever volunteer that type of negative information. We appreciate your candor and thank you very much. And that was it. They thanked us. And to our surprise, consultants started sending us letters, emails, and phone calls thanking us for protecting their reputations. And since that time, we've never had another incident like that. And what we learned is that you get the behavior you tolerate. Every parent and teacher understands that. If you have an effective deterrence, there has to be a high likelihood of getting caught, a certainty of getting punished, and a punishment that really hurts. And with that, we moved on. And we were able to continue growing the company. The company's grown very, very well. We have over 1 million customers today. Yesterday, Carol and I were up in Phoenix, or over in Phoenix. It's 111 degrees there today, so we're glad to be back in Dallas. But we were at a conference, and I was asked to give a much longer description of Ambit, its history, and where we are today. And it was in front of a crowd of about 1,000 people yesterday evening. And at the very end, I closed my talks with some lessons learned. And I was nervous about it. It wasn't a group of young Catholic professionals. It wasn't a group of Ambit people who were receptive to this message more often than not. It was a very diverse group of people from all over the country, with all different affiliations. And what I told them, young people all, was that this entrepreneurial journey is always a surprise. It's never predictable. You're always going to have your ups and downs. It's always going to be winding. It's always going to be bumpy. But it will always be very, very exciting. Secondly, you can't do it by yourself. You can't do it alone. President Reagan, when he was in the Oval Office, had a small brass plaque on a credenza behind his desk. And the plaque read, "There's no limit to what you can do or where you can go. If you don't mind, who gets the credit?" What President Reagan was emphasizing is that success is all about teamwork. It's about gathering a team, guiding them with a vision, and then encouraging them and rewarding them with recognition. It's really what happens in business today. The key is to attract and retain great people. And to do that, you have to keep your standards high. We always say, be the finest and most respected. Never sacrifice integrity for growth. Always give credit where credit is due. And don't exaggerate. Please don't exaggerate. Exaggeration is like quicksand. Once you land in it, it's almost impossible to get out of it. It's one of those things, you can never build a long-term sustainable business on a foundation built on quicksand. Build your foundation, build your business on rock. Build it on the truth. What was interesting is I followed that up with the final piece. And my final comment to them was, always calibrate your moral compass. Pray often. My father gets on his knees every night to this day. And by his example, he taught us to pray for the wisdom to know what is right, the courage to choose what is right, and the strength to do what is right. And I wish them all well. But I had no idea how that message might be received. It's not something I rarely do when I get out in front of an audience and talk about praying. It's just not part of my routine. But I did it. And all evening long, people came up to me and Carolyn and thanked us for the message we had given. It just wasn't something they were accustomed to hearing, and certainly that crowd had not heard in years. That was part one. Part two, cistercian. As Jere mentioned, I started going out there in 1965, and my lasting claim and claim at cistercian is to this day, I was the youngest student ever to attend the school. I was 8 years old when I got out there. They had a fourth grade back then, but I was still young in my class. We started in 1965, and I graduated in 1974. And the great thing about the school is that those priests take a vow of stability, which means that they're going to stay at the school throughout their lives. They're not traveling around to other locations. So when you go back in years after you graduate, you always see the same people. And for that matter, many of the late teachers there are there years after years, decade after decade. So I go back there today and still see people who were there when I arrived in 1965. My best friend and I, best friend's a guy named Jim Roney, who I think you all have met before. And Jim and I started in the fourth grade together. We graduated. We went off to Stanford together. We came back. We went down to the University of Texas Graduate School together. We owned a car together. We owned a house together. We did all sorts of stuff together. We're still best friends to this day. Well, after graduating from business school and coming back here to Dallas, there was a Christmas Eve we approached Father Bernard, who was the headmaster at the time. We said, "Father, what can we do to help the school?" He said, "I need a science center." We said, "Okay, how much do those cost?" He said, $1 million. We said, "Okay, we've never done this, but we'll figure it out." So we committed to go out and raise some money to build a science center. And we didn't know what we were doing, but we went and knocked on the doors of a lot of people who did, who had been raising money all over Dallas for many, many years. And they said, "Here's what you do." And they gave us a laundry list of items. And about the time we started, hearing people say the exact same thing that we'd already taken notes on, we realized, okay, now it's just time to go out and get the job done. So we went off and we worked with sisters to help get that science center in place. Fast forward a few years to 1990. I was in a chapel in Minturn, Colorado, outside of Beaver Creek. And it was New Year's Day, or the day before New Year's, December 31, 1990. And I was with my family and sitting in the back of this beautiful white chapel that was about 75 years old at the time. And I was sitting by the window and snow was coming down, and I was looking around and I was just taken at how beautiful this chapel was that was built by miners 75 years ago. And I looked around, I saw the woodwork, and I just saw the simplicity but the beauty of it all. And I realized that, now was the time for Cistercian to have its own chapel. Up until then, Cistercian had a chapel, and the roofs were probably about 8 feet tall. If you jumped up, you'd hit them and knock the tiles out. It was not a place that really was inspiring if you wanted to look at something where people wanted to go every week. And there were a few windows off on the side, and it just wasn't the place you would expect in an abbey. But for whatever reason, as I sat there and I looked around, it got louder and louder that it's time to build a chapel for Cistercian. Couldn't wait to get back home. Came back to Dallas, went over to the Abbey, sat down with the Abbot, and said, Father, it's time for an Abbey. It's time for an Abbey chapel. It's time that we build one. And he looked at me and he said, what are you thinking? And I said, well, I think we can have alumni go out and raise the money. We can have an alumnus who will design the chapel. We'll have an alumnus who will build the chapel. And we'll have an alumnus who will say Mass in the chapel, Father and people. Because if we don't do it, then the Cistercian we grew up with won't be the same as the Cistercian our kids encounter in the years to come. We need this chapel for the sake of the Abbey as well as the church, as well as the school. And at the same time, what I didn't realize was that he, the Abbot, was going through a struggle. This Abbey at that point in time was shrinking. Every year they were losing some of the older priests. And he knew they needed an Abbey chapel, but he had no idea where to start with that. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this young alum came walking in and said, we, the alumni, want to make this as a gift to the Abbey for what you did to us and how you helped us grow up. And he couldn't believe it. We brought in alumni, Corky Cunningham to come in, and there's a song, you're always 17 in your hometown. Well, Corky had one of those always 17 reputations. Now, he was probably 35 at the time, and they remembered him when he was 17. And their impression of him was, you want to build a chapel? We saw you at church. What are you talking about? But he came in, and he went through the process of describing what they wanted to do and how the process was worked out. And the priests loved it. They embraced it. So what ended up happening was Corky started designing chapels, but his first designs were kind of far out there. We all realized this wasn't going to cut it. And he was encouraged, along with the Abbot, to finally, let's just go and see the chapels in Europe. Let's go see the Cistercian monasteries all over the continent. And they went back there and they started looking at chapels and Cistercian churches that had been built in the 12, 13, and 1400s. And they were ancient, but at the same time, there were many similarities between all of them. And one of them were these giant stones, the stones that they built them with. And at the same time, back here in Texas, we had received a gift of a limestone from another man here in Dallas named Lynn Northrup. And so suddenly, we began to put these dots together. And Corky came back with the design for the Cistercian Chapel off of 114 today, which is just beautiful. It's almost ancient, and it's it's just a holy place when you walk on the inside. You know you're in a sacred space. And that got done. We built it. And by the time it was all completed, suddenly the Abbey's, its future prospects began to turn. They today have almost a full monastery. They've had 12 young men come in the last 10 years who have joined the Abbey. And there's more who may be coming in this coming summer. I'm not saying it was only because of the chapel, it wasn't. But what happened was sitting quietly in that church in Minturn, as the snow came down, I looked around this beautiful white, space I was in. There was a voice. It's the only time I've ever really had it like that. But it just said, this is something you really need to be doing. And came back, and all the stars lined up, providence took place, and we got a chapel out in Cistercian. Number 3, balance. Who here has a difficult time with balance in their life? you're not raising your hand, you really got to work that. You know, years from now, when you all have gray hair, and you flip back through the memories of your life, you'll smile most at those accomplishments of yours that were the hardest to achieve, that really mattered the most, and that took a long period of time to get to. And there's not a lot that fall in that category. Things that are really hard, that really matter, that took a long period of time and an enormous amount of effort. And you have to be able to say, if it hadn't been for me, this good thing might not have happened the way it did. You have to make a contribution. So what falls into that category? What takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and really is important? I think in everybody's case, first of all, if you're in that position, your marriage, your family, raising children, your friends and neighbors, your community, your work, and equally as important, your faith. Those are the key fundamental things in your life. Those are things that you have to invest your time in. So as I look around, and I think all of us go through this process, the question becomes, how can we find the time to focus on these areas? Your marriage, your family, your friends and neighbors, your community, your work, and your faith. Every one of them is demanding. Every one is tugging at you all the time. What I'm amazed about is we have a 16-year-old daughter, and every once in a while, not often, we have her phone in our hands because of something that's happened. That phone is buzzing. It seems like every few seconds. There's these group texts. Anybody here in the group text? I've never seen it before, but I figured it out. And that phone just buzzes incessantly. I don't know how she does it or anybody who's involved in that actually can focus. It's incredibly hard, I think, to have the focus to be able to prioritize in your life when you're constantly being distracted. And you have this compulsion to respond. Or as I've heard this new term, FOMO, fear of missing out. I mean, everybody has that, I guess, to a certain degree. But it's one of these things that it's difficult to focus on really what's most important in your life if you're constantly in a state of distraction. I was listening to years ago, this guy named Lou Holtz. Everybody here knows who Lou Holtz is. He's a great commentator, but before that, he was a great football coach. And he was being asked, Coach Holtz, why were you so successful? What did you do differently that enabled you to be so successful? And he said, it was very simple. I always ask people, when? What's important now? Everybody, all my coaches, all my players, always had to think through the process of when. When they got up in the morning, what's important now? Get out of bed. I used to laugh at that until I had a teenage boy, and then I understand what you're talking about. Are you saying get out of bed? You're going to go to practice. What's important now? It's nutrition. Get a good breakfast. You're off to school. What's important now? Well, be prepared. Get your schoolwork done. And he said, I constantly had everybody asking themselves all day long, what's important now? We're all a little ADD. We're all focused and torn and pulled in many different directions. We need those mid-course calibrations, mid-course corrections to stay on path. And by asking yourself what's important now, it'll make you stop and think of, is what I'm doing right now really what's most important for me to reach my goals? But the key thing there is, what are your goals? What are the goals you're trying to accomplish? What are the goals you're trying to achieve? These can't be, just random goals. They're goals you ought to have written down. And if you're really, interested in making sure that you're focused on what's most important in your life, your family, your marriage, your friends, your neighbors, your community, and your work, and your faith, then put it down on paper. Figure out, what is it that I want to accomplish? Where is it I want to go? Where do I want to be in 6 months, 1 year, 5 years? And then as you go through your course of life, ask yourself, what's important now? It's hard. I think the hardest thing is when you're raising a family and you're being pulled in all directions, to balance your life and sort out your religion with your work, with all the other extracurricular activities you have. But I think by you all being here tonight, it's a great sign that you're interested in figuring it all out. I'm proud of you for being here. Thank you very much for having me. Let's go back to questions. Questions? I was told we have 15 minutes, so yes, please.
What inspired you to enter the energy sector when you started Ambit?
What was it inspired me to do what with David?
To enter the energy sector?
Well, desperation. I had been in telecommunications and had started off by building fiber optic networks, and then layered on top of those networks, voice networks and data networks, both local and long distance. And then on the data side, bandwidth, we did everything from dark fiber to providing bandwidth. And all of a sudden, the internet came along, and when the internet came, its demand for what we had just built was just monstrous. And it kept on doubling every 3 months. Finally, in 2000, we had 3 companies knocking on our door wanting to buy us. So we sold. And the interesting story behind it was we sold to the one who was the strongest and the wealthiest of all. And it had the most highly respected management team. It had $2 billion in the bank. Everybody thought this was the perfect fit for that company, Caprock. And we took stock, and 9 months later, they went bankrupt. The stock went from $27 down to 27 cents. Didn't work out quite the way we thought it would. So I looked around and said, oh, I'll do something else. And I started another telecommunication company. But the world had changed. It wasn't the same world. It was much more difficult to get traction. And slowly, over a couple of years, this thing started to rise up and started to do what we hoped it might. When the Federal Communications Commission came in and took away the only tariff anybody was using at the time to compete in that marketplace in telephony. And so it was time to start all over yet again. And what I noticed at the time was that the back office requirements to support telecommunications were very similar to what we thought would be the back office requirements to support electricity. So looked at it closely and said, I bet we can do this, and just decided, let's get it. And it was the dawn of deregulation in the electricity markets. When AT&T started in long distance, it had 100% of the long distance market. But probably about 15 years after deregulation, it had lost 73%. It still had 27% when it sold SBC. And what we saw was the opportunity to come in and do something similar in electricity. But it really was desperation because the telecom company just lost its key tariff, and that was going into an irreversible decline. It was time to do something new. Yes?
How do you manage or balance being the CEO of a quickly growing company, continuing and making your family, your community, your faith priorities in your life?
The question was, how do I balance being a CEO of a company and at the same time all those other things that I talked about? My kids think I'm really weird, but for the most part, I don't watch TV. I don't get emails on my phone. I don't, I'm not on Facebook, and I don't Twitter or tweet or whatever. The key thing is just what I talked about. It's one of those things where I constantly make lists, and those lists help define what I think is important to get done, whether it's that day, that month, or just the old list has gotten so unreadable, it's time to make a new list. But I think the key thing is focusing on what really is important in your life. It's so easy to get wrapped up in things, and you come out 6 months later, a year later, and goes, I didn't do anything that I thought I was going to get done. And it's just one of those struggles that you have. But in my case, what works well is coming up with a list and looking at it every morning, saying what's really important today to get done. And then during the course of the day, if I'm doing something different, come back to that list and decide what needs to be done next. But it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. Yes?
At some point when you were talking about Ambit, you mentioned, or you said, this is something that we pray about. And I was surprised by the week. Did you found Ambit with some Catholic partners? And how do you integrate your faith in your daily business life?
Sure.
And how do you reconcile the values of your faith with some realities of the business world that can be at times conflicting?
You know, there's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. The question is, how do you reconcile the values of our faith with what's going on in the company? And at the same time, did I start the company with another Catholic? And the answer is no. I started with another Christian. And we probably agree on 99.5%, 99.9% of the same values that are out there in the world. And he's a great, great partner. And when you've been in the foxhole with somebody for 7 years, You know what they're all about, and he's a first-class individual. It's Chris Chambers who I'm talking about, and another guy named John Burke. And all of us have the same value system. All of us look at it the same way. And when it comes time to making a very difficult decision, we all quietly in our own ways go off and pray about it and come back together. But we do things also a little bit differently that you don't see in a lot of companies. When we have a Thanksgiving meal or a Christmas meal or some special event there, we will say grace before we have the meal. A lot of companies don't do that. But we in a small company are still in a position to be able to do it. We don't get out every day, and it's not on the walls. We don't do a lot, this is what we're all about. This is the Catholic faith. This is the Christian, Christian belief in the world. But we try to act it out every single day. And we act it out in such a way where we try to set the example. And a consistent example over a period of time, people realize who you are and what you're all about and where you're coming from. And just like last night in Phoenix, when I stood up in front of everybody and said, pray often, and told them what to pray for, they were startled. I was nervous because I normally don't do that in front of a crowd. I don't know 1,000 people. But that's just what we've been doing for years. And I think many times one of the highest compliments we get is when people come to us and say, this is like a family company. And that in some ways says your values here are similar to the values I had growing up. And we really appreciate being a part of this company. Yes?
In how many states of the Union is Ambit present?
We're in 9 states right now, 56 utility markets. There are probably another half dozen states that we see in the next few years that we might, I shouldn't say that out here because no one might repeat it. Anyway, we have a number of other states out there that are very, very promising. And we'll get into over time. Every state that we go into, every market that we get into within those states takes us about 6 months. There's a lot of coordination on the IT side, the electronic interface side, the protocol side, the regulatory side that we have to work out before we enter in those new markets. But there's still a lot in front of us. Yes?
I really liked your story about the honest communications you had with your employees and with the PSC during that one example you gave. You talked about some of the other times when your company was going bankrupt and some other tricky situations you dealt with. Is that value towards honest communication something you've developed or something you've just felt like you've had in each company and each business that you've had?
The question was the honest communications during difficult times. And what we did at that moment in time when we had the road consultants up in New York, and is that something that was just that one incident, or is it more frequent than that? It runs through the course of the business. And there are many times where there's too much information. You can frighten a lot of folks because they don't understand the nuances of what you're talking about. So you've got to be careful sometimes about just how much information to put out there. But we have always tried to be candid. We have always tried to put out, in the right tones what we're going through. Let me give you an example. Up through 2010, we didn't grow very fast. We went very slowly into new markets. But beginning in 2011, we started shooting out of the gate because we realized we had the firepower internally to take on that task. At the same time, from a strategic perspective, there were a lot of companies beginning to imitate us in some of the markets we hadn't arrived in yet. And we knew that if they got there too far in front of us, that would be a strategic hurdle for us to get past once we finally arrived. So we began to move a little faster than we normally would have to expand. When we did that, we knew that it was going to put a great burden on the IT department, that we were asking them to do something that they weren't really prepared to handle. And we knew the entire organization was going to have a difficult time. We did it. We got in there. We beat the competition when we did it. And then we turned around and we had a lot of issues we had to take care of. We were very open and honest about what happened and why. We told everybody in the organization that, look, we knew we were going to make this thing difficult. We were going to run the front lines out there, and now it's time for the supply lines to catch up. We're going to take a 6-month break. If it needs to be longer, it can be longer. It can be 8 months, 9 months. In fact, it is taking about 9 months. Where we're going to just halt everything and allow the IT department to come back to us and say, we need to catch up. We need to rebuild. We need to strengthen. We need to create new processes. We need to do all these items to really lay the next foundation for the future growth of the company. But we were honest and candid about it. If we hadn't been, or if we'd been ignorant of it and just pretended it didn't exist, I'm not sure where the company would be today. And so there's always, there's a strong demand for honesty because everybody in the organization sees what's going on. They can feel it. And then they're waiting to see, are you going to respond to it? Are you ignorant of it? Are you denying that it exists? Or do you just not care? And all those things can damage you to an executive if he doesn't pay attention and listen to what's going on in the organization. Does that pretty much answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Yes?
How much technical knowledge did you have for telecommunications, or did you have to hire an expert in the field?
No. The question was, do I have any technical knowledge? Somebody asked me that the other day, and they said, well, what is your expertise? I said, well, I don't know anything about IT. I'm not very good at marketing. I'm a terrible person on customer service and on the phone calls there. I'm just kind of there. You know, what my role has been, when I grew up, I loved to play with Legos and puzzles. I love building things and then figuring out puzzles and putting pieces in places. And I'm still doing the same thing today. It's just with different kind of building blocks. What I look at is that my role in the organization is to set the tone of the company. It's to set the strategy for where we're going. Make certain we have the capital to get there. Make certain that all the people who are direct reports to me have everything they need to get their job done. And then follow through to make sure we have the right culture inside the organization. Those are more general rather than specific. I do take a great deal of time to focus on the hedging side of our business, which is critical to the existence of the company. But other than that, I've tried to bring in people who are experts in their own field. And then the hard thing is to get everybody to work with each other. It's a big challenge in any company, no matter the size. Getting all the executives to have the same goals, same aspirations, and rowing in the same direction at the same pace is always a challenge. And that's probably where I spend most of my time. Yes?
Yes, Mr. Thompson. What is your view on, as technology gets better and better, and as far as free energy? Because not necessarily with Ambit free energy, but what is your view on, as technology gets better and people now, companies and organizations focus on somewhat of a free energy, do you feel that that will affect your business in the future, or how do you consider individuals looking for the free energy in the energy market?
Are you talking about the free energy which we offer?
No, not with Ambit energy, but just in general, as there is research and billions of dollars put into research that allows individuals to find ways of creating energy naturally.
Right. It's an interesting question. The question is, when will future technology suddenly, be disruptive to existing technology? In telecom, when we got started, fiber optics caused the price of a long distance call to fall from 35 cents a minute to basically free. It became so inexpensive it was free. It's given away. And energy, there's always a cost to generate the power. There's always going to be a cost. It's out there. We have not seen a technology that allows us to generate megawatts for nothing, or to transport megawatts for nothing. And when we talk about, well, someday people may have tiny nuclear reactors at their home, or solar panels, or fusion, or whatever it may be, that's so far out there, we don't see it coming at us right away. And at the same time, there's a huge capital cost that's going to be required for homes to do it. And they'll do an analysis and say, well, am I better off just buying it or putting it in my own and being self-sufficient? So it's not something we're worried about today, but it's probably something you all in your lifetimes may see. So we'll see where that goes. Yes.
Okay.
Back to you.
I think there are quite a few either entrepreneurs in here or people with dreams of entrepreneurship. What would your advice be to a young professional in determining if it's just a wild dream that maybe they should push back, or if it truly is a career endeavor that they could take hold of and run with?
I'd say go for it if you have an entrepreneurial spirit. I really do. If your kids are all about to graduate from high school and go on to college, and all your college funds have been set aside, that's the only startup capital you might have, don't do it. But if you don't have children, or if your children are young, that's the perfect age to get started. Your downside risk is minimal. You're going to, how many of y'all live in apartments? If the worst case happened, where would you live? You'd be in an apartment, possibly back with your parents. I mean, it's just the downside. The downside risk is so minimal when you're young. I would say go for it. That's a prime time to be out there. You look at different windows of opportunity. When they all open up, you got to dive through it. One, is the product something that's at the right time? Is it something that there's a demand for? Two, can you go out and raise the capital for it? Will people be willing to back what you want to do? And then three, where is it in your life? Your life cycle. Is it a good period in your time, in your life, to get out there and start? I had breakfast with a young man about a week ago, and he was 25 years old. He said, "Oh, I always want to be an entrepreneur." I said, "What are you doing now?" He looked at me, and I said, "Look, you're as smart as any president out here in town. The only thing you don't have is experience, and you can get experience. Just go get it. And once you get that experience, it's invaluable. It's just as good as any kind of book learning you're going to get out there. But always know what your downside is. You want to make certain that you have an idea of just how much you can put at stake to get this thing started. But I'd encourage you, go off and go do it at this stage in your life. There's no better time. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Andrew.
What are some of the core teachings that you take out of the Catholic faith on a regular basis that you bring back to work with you?
First and foremost is living your faith. The question is, what are the core teachings of Catholic faith that I take with me into the office place? And I think that the person you are at home or in church or in the community should be the exact same person that shows up in the office place. There should be no difference. When I looked at my father, he was the same was when he was in business. The same person in bad times as he was in good times. In bad times, he never blamed anybody else. And in good times, he never took the credit. And that was a great example of a humble person. You come and look at our offices over there, and we have fold-up $19 tables. They're not real attractive, and they're pretty cheap. But it's frugality. And we're out there in the middle of the open. We're vulnerable. We're transparent. We're accessible. Everybody can see us. We encourage them to walk up to us. We don't want problems to fester. We want them to come and get quick decisions so that they can move on and we can solve issues that come our way. And I think all those little things about how you set up a company, we bolted those words, never sacrifice integrity for growth, on the brick wall in the front entry when you walk in our offices. Everybody sees it every day. It's another statement of who we are. When we expanded to the 6th floor, we had another wall painted with the same words. But the key thing is that you follow through and your actions are just as loud as your words are. And that what you do and how you do it matches what you've been telling everybody here about.
I think we have time for one more question.
One more question. Anybody else?
With all the ups and downs in your company, what kept you moving forward and not giving up on your company, believing in it?
With all the ups and downs, what has kept me moving forward and not giving up? Every night, one of the joys of my life is that Carolyn and I walk our dog, Pat. And we walk for about 20 minutes. And she has to listen to me bark and talk and just go off on and unwind about what went on during the day. And I encourage you all, if you don't have a dog, get one just for the nightly walk. It's wonderful for your marriage to have that time alone where you're not with kids or distractions or anything else. And through all of that, it was just this faith that it was going to work out. We always could find a solution. There would always be a way out. And many times, it just happened that way. Some of the best things that have happened to us in Ambit have happened because of who we are. And we never expected it, but it's come back to us in spades. So, if you don't have a dog, get one. Let me just, if I can close with one last thing. My challenge to you all is to try to find balance in your life. My challenge is that you all go out, and maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, put down what's really important to you. And those areas that are so critical to your long-term happiness, and really to affirming what your faith is and what your faith is all about. And then, as Lou Holtz would say, constantly asking yourself, what's important now? And if that means setting aside your cell phone for a week, try it. See what happens. The world will not stop. We didn't have cell phones for a long, long time. I promise you, you'll be able to find more time to dedicate toward the things that are most important in your life and not be distracted by things that suddenly consume your time and you wonder why you can't get things completed. So my hope is that all of you all try to seek that balance in your life by prioritizing and refocusing time and time and time again every day on what's important now. Thank you.